All right. Hi, everybody. Don Tredinnick is here with us tonight. And he began photography at a young age when his grandfather gave him his first camera. He has since continued to create images that capture a moment in time as well as the emotion. His images, please mute yourself and turn off your cameras. Okay. His images have appeared in Lake Superior Magazine and North Cascades National Park Field Guide and have been on display at the Redwoods National Park Visitor Center, Minnesota Valley National Wildlife Refuge, and Fairview Ridges Hospital. He is the owner of Frozen Hiker Photography, LLC, where he teaches and provides classes to improve photographer skills. His classes are offered at the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum, Centennial School District Community Education, Minnetonka Center for the Arts, and Hot Sam's Photo Park. I'm going to have to ask you about Hot Sam's when you're finished here. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Don.
Okay, thanks. And thanks for the introduction. Also have one new venue that I'll be teaching at in New Richmond, Wisconsin. So there's a library over there that contacted me and actually have a class coming up there in May. So it'll be my first class working with them. Hopefully it'll be the first of many. So I'm expanding east of the river, as they say. So today, talking about adding context and scale to landscape photos. I do a lot of different types of photography, but landscape photography is something that that I really enjoy. And if I had to pick one type of photography that is probably the thing that I do the most of, it would be landscape photography. So we kind of already went through this. So I'll just actually skip over onto the next. I do have a website, frozenhiker.com. That's my pet polar bear on the homepage there. They do like, if you come across them, they like to be tickled under their chin. So they may or may not give you your hand back when you do that. But that's a good place to go to find, what I've got going on and all that. So. Also, it's a good place if you are signed up for a class, and that it's a good place to get last minute information associated with it, especially for some of the things that I do through like the refuge, since changes to their website have to go through, as you can imagine with any government agency, all kinds of different hoops. Sometimes I can actually get the information up much quicker than they can when there's been a last minute change. So it's always good to kind of check the website the day before a class. So speaking of the Arboretum, I do have a number of classes coming up out there, starting tomorrow, actually. So bird photography lecture and field shoot, 17th and 19th. March 10th, actually doing, so March 10th and 12th, a brand new program, Introduction to Camera Techniques for Nature Photography, followed by a field shoot. And that's going to be that's something we've been asked for a lot. And so we're excited to be offering that. And then the Spring Flower Program, that looks like July is actually when I've got my first in-person class. When I look at this, because the July one is also a hybrid, which is the Spring Flowers class. And there's no place better than the Arboretum for that. And then you'll notice there's a big gap from July to September where I'm not doing much out there. And that's because I will actually be in Africa for about 3 weeks shooting out there. So pretty excited about that. Also, some other things I've got going on. We do have a workshop coming up, actually a little over a week up on the North Shore, 25th through 27th. There's actually 2 spots left. So if anybody's interested in that, just go out to the website. You'll find out all the information. We are hoping to have the horse photography retreat this year. Last year, the owner of the horses was in a training accident, and so we weren't able to do it. But she's much better now. In fact, she's got some show dogs. She was just in Michigan competing with one of the show dogs. So she's doing much better, fortunately. And I'm joined at that by Barb Thompson from Twin Eyes Photography. We run that one jointly. And then our workshop in Ely every fall, where we get early access to the Wolf Center. So we're in there before anybody else, before it's open to the public. And more importantly, before the sun comes up over the hill behind it. So then there's just too much glare to get the wolves. And then Centennial School District, some of the things we have going on there. We have a macro class coming up middle of March, and then April, another class on nature photography. And we're currently working on May through July, I believe. So there'll be some more things being announced there as we get into it. Also have a Facebook group, Frozen Hiker Photography Workshops and Classes. So anybody that's been to any program I've done, including Camera Club presentations, are welcome to join. So feel free to go out. A lot of times I have early announcement for classes and that, so it gives people a chance to sign up for things before they're opened up to the general public. So tonight, I'm going to actually talk about quite a few different things. And as we were mentioning before, for those of you that joined a little bit later, for questions and that, if you could just put them into the chat, and I will stop periodically and we'll go through the questions, and then at the end we'll have a general question and answer period as well. I'm going to start talking about common landscape pitfalls, then talk about scale, some basics around depth and distance and understanding where to focus, and talk about size and showing size, working with light, and then also context and sense of place and storytelling. So basically, what's on the agenda for tonight? So it's quite a packed presentation, but we'll get through it as best we can. So it's kind of interesting. I think most people, when they first start getting into photography, a lot of times it's because you're going on a trip or a vacation, and you take these photos of these beautiful scenes that you see, and you come back and you're kind of disappointed. And so the question comes up, why is landscape photography hard? Nothing. It's just there, right? It's not like wildlife. It's not like people. It's not like sports or anything else where you've got things moving, and it's just there. So why do we run into issues with that? And there's really a lot of different reasons, but really what it comes down to is we see it in 3 dimensions, but unfortunately our camera does not. Our camera just sees in 2. And so we need to have ways to kind of trick the eye using things like anchor points, leading lines, use of negative space, and we'll see some examples of these as we kind of go through. But we also have to deal with a lot of things that you just don't think about when you're just out and about. So challenging lighting, it might be really sunny, not a cloud in the sky, or it could be completely overcast, boring foregrounds, boring skies, distracting elements, all of these things that you see listed here. But some of the things we don't think about are things like heat and humidity. And if you've ever been to the Grand Canyon, that's probably the best example of how humidity can really affect your photo. Because most of the time, especially if you're there in the summertime, the evaporation from the river down in the bottom and all of the humidity that just gets stuck in the canyon makes for a very hazy look. And then with heat, we have what's referred to as heat shimmers. And they're these little waves that you see as you look across. And if you're taking a photograph of a prairie, as an example, you'll see these heat shimmers. They'll actually affect the image quality. And then things like wind and rain and all of the other things that come into play. So I'm just going to go through some common pitfalls, show some examples of what these pitfalls look like. And so the first one is failure to show depth. And I think this often happens the very first time we visit a location, where we just get so enamored with what's in front of us. And it's just like, wow, I just can't believe this. When we take the photo, we get back and it's like, this doesn't look anything like what I saw. And the reason for it is that when we look at something, like this, everything is flat. There's nothing, there's no shadows, there's nothing really in the foreground, nothing that's giving any kind of sense that there's any depth. It looks like everything is just right on top of each other. Another issue we run into is just failure to show size. And sometimes this comes down to, lens selection, using too wide of an angle of a lens, which, sometimes that's some bad advice we get from, a camera shop when we're getting our initial kits. They're like, oh, you want a really wide angle lens if you're going to be going, to the desert or to the mountains or something like that. But the problem is it really kind of flattens everything out, makes things in the distance look a lot smaller. And in this case, in this photo, I just don't have anything in here as a reference to give you enough information about the size of the elements in here. Are those rocks really big, or are they relatively small? You really can't tell. You might have some ideas if you've been out, to this part of Arizona where this is, but, probably, it's really impossible to really know what this looks like, and it definitely looks much better. And then we hear a lot about leading lines, but then we want to make sure that we're not leading the viewer to nowhere. So leading lines are an extremely important thing, in a landscape image, and we saw that in the cover photo where we had that nice stream giving us that nice leading line back to the church. But here, you could argue that, along the journey, there's some nice saguaro, cacti there, but really the most prominent one is towards the front, as well as the little cluster of cacti, just at the bottom. But there's really nothing exciting as you get back into this photo. So there's no really reward going on. Now, if you have a really, interesting set of, things along the journey, that can work, well, or if, you've got a really interesting sky you're bringing it back to, or something like that. But, in this case, there's really just nothing back there. And then kind of going back to the wide angle lens issue, having an overpowering foreground element. And my guess is you've probably seen in some of the salons where, someone will submit a photo like this, and the judges comment, it's typically something along the lines of, I'm not sure if, the main subject is supposed to be the mountains in the background or this rock in the foreground. It's really kind of confusing to me as to, what I should be looking at. The interesting thing is that this is actually an easy one to fix, even staying with the same lens. And it actually involves doing two things. One is moving back a little bit, but also getting a lot higher. And there are a number of really famous landscape photographers that are known for actually, getting up on ladders, or in the case of Ansel Adams, on top of a station wagon, and taking the photo that way. That eliminates this overpowering foreground element. So the foreground element is still there, but its size makes a lot more sense in the overall scene. And then pitfall number 5 is the no point of reference. And so, here you've got, some flowers, you got some trees, you got some logs, but where do I want you to look? There's really no place for you to land on and to kind of look around in this photo. And this is one of those things where sometimes the scene looks really, really good when you're looking at it with your eyes, but it just does not translate well into a two-dimensional image. And then another issue we run into is what's referred to as the bisected image. And this is where we've got that horizon line, directly through the center, And, in this particular case, and I think a lot of times when we have this, it's because we're trying to put too much into one photo. And one of the places that I see this the most is with reflections. And so we'll have a river or a lake, and we'll have a reflection, and the reflection will be the same size as what's in the background. It's split right across the middle. It tends to make the image, number one, very flat. Number two, it really almost is two photos fighting with each other. So I think a lot of times in the case of reflections, we're better off thinking about how do we want to have either the full reflection and just part of what's being reflected, or vice versa. And so I like to try to think of how the different elements are going to come together, and not have quite as much of one or the other. And just as a reference, this is something called the Devil's Golf Course out in Death Valley, and really kind of an interesting place that you do not want to walk around in shorts, because all those little things coming off that stuff in the foreground are like little razor blades. And I can tell you from personal experience, they hurt a lot. So we've seen the pitfalls. So let's talk a little bit about how we go about solving those. And the first is, how do we deal with depth and distance? And really kind of understanding how to deal with depth and distance is going to give a really good foundation then for everything else that you do with landscape photography. And so here we're out in Death Valley, Mesquite Sand Dunes, one of my favorite places to shoot. And this is a really good example of many things contributing to a flat image. And as I look at this, I've got way too much foreground. And my thought process at the time was, I've got these kind of interesting lines here. I've got the different patterns in the sand that make kind of an interesting foreground. And then I've got these bushes, and then I've got the signature dune in the background, which if you've ever been out there and you've been to the Mesquite Sand Dunes, you know that sand dune in the back is massive, not anywhere near what it looks like, in this photo. But there's some other things too that are also kind of hurting. And, one of them is by going with a very wide angle lens, it does make that signature dune look, relatively small. And then to make it worse, I managed to get exactly the line of those are actually the Bullfrog Hills in the background, lining up almost exactly with the top of that sand dune. So there's no separation. It looks like it just changed color for some reason, but it looks like it's just a continuation of the same thing. So a lot of different issues there. And so this was at 35 millimeters, f8 1/13 of a second. It was actually shot with a 16 to 35 millimeter lens. And I only point that out because, I realized that this wasn't going to be a successful image, but I also realized that out in the middle of the sand dunes, I also needed to change lenses, which is something I don't recommend. But be that as it may, by changing lenses and just moving just a few feet over, I got this image, literally taken 10 minutes apart from each other. And there's a lot of changes that came in that now add a lot of depth to this photo. The first is I fixed the converging lines. And so now the Bullfrog Hills do intersect the sand dune in the back, but now it does it in a way that I can tell that there's clearly a separation, that they're clearly two different things. Those little bumps, by the way, on the sand dune are actually people. I think it's almost impossible to photograph without having people up on that giant dune. The other thing is I have a really good foreground element now. It's nice and low. It's down towards the lower right-hand side, and it's really where it kind of needs to be. But then more importantly, I'm providing you a path to get back there. So there's this implied line that's taking you from one bush to another, to another, to another, all the way back to that sand dune. And this was with 50 millimeter f8, 1/20th of a second. And so, just that change in focal length, which also makes that sand dune in the back seem bigger, and just changing my position just a little bit, getting a little bit higher and just moving a little bit over, made a huge difference to the scene. And one other thing that I'll mention here is the magic of 50 millimeters. And for those of you that remember film days, and especially before zoom lenses became really prominent, the quote unquote kit lens was a 50 millimeter f1.8. Came on almost every, especially beginner cameras. And the reason for that is that is the same kind of perspective that we see with our eyes. And so it does tend to give a very realistic view, especially for landscape images. So it's something that I find kind of interesting when I actually look at a lot of the images that I take, that I find that I actually shoot a lot of them right around 50 millimeters. My primary landscape lens is actually the 24 to 70 Nikon lens. So let's talk a little bit about some basics around, some of the different things that we could do to show depth. And so the first is, the foreground element as a supporting actor. And we want to make sure it's not going to overpower the main subject. So if you think back to that one pitfall where we had the overpowering foreground element, and we need to make sure we've got some level of separation between the elements, and we do need to have front to back sharpness. If the background is a little bit out of focus, that's going to take away quite a bit. If the foreground's a little bit out, that's going to be distracting as well. Interestingly enough, you can actually have a little bit of softness in the midground. Another is having the foreground element as the main actor. I call this Fred Flintstone's house. This is actually in Joshua Tree National Park. In this case, the foreground element does need to be the most powerful element in the frame, and that's because that is the main subject. And I still need to have some separation because I still want to show all that depth in the background, but I can actually have, and most likely want, the background to be just a little soft. Again, just to make sure that, my viewer is really looking at what I want them to look at. And sometimes I won't actually achieve that softness in camera. I'll actually go and add that in post-processing. Just add a little bit of Gaussian blur or something just to make that background just slightly softer, just so I can make sure that you're looking at the spot that I want you looking.
Don, somebody put in the chat and posed a question, and it was the same thing that I was wondering about. Do you use focus stacking?
So I do, and actually I do it both with landscape photography as well as macro photography. And I actually have, so on my website, there's a blog. There's actually one blog post out there about using it with landscape photography. That one was put out a few years back. And then I just did actually put out one on, actually two, it's actually a two-parter on using that with macro photography. But focus stacking is a great tool for landscape photography, especially if you're using a longer focal length lens and you want to make sure that your foreground is sharp, without, sacrificing the background. And it's really easy to do. So the approach that I use is I pick out the interesting objects in the scene, and then I just take photos with those different objects being in focus. I don't have to have everything front to back. I just need to make sure that those elements are sharp. And usually there's enough depth of field between them that it'll work out. But even if it gets a little bit soft in between them, sometimes I think that actually helps the image rather than hurt it. So that's the approach that I take with it. Yeah, so leading lines, this is probably something that, I think it's one of the first things that we're told when it comes to landscape photography. And, as I mentioned, there needs to be some kind of a reward. In this case, I'm bringing you back to the trees in the background, that nice set of birches sitting back there. Plus, we've got all of the fall color as well, or what's left of the fall color, I should say. It was a little bit late in the season. And one of the things that we want to be careful of with leading lines is that we have them moving into the photo. And so what I mean by that is, if you notice that what I'm using for a leading line here, maybe gets only to maybe 25% up the frame. So it looks really deep. It's going deep into the photo as opposed to going up. And so if I had this leading line taking up, let's say, half or 2/3, it would almost look like it was pointing straight up as opposed to pointing into the photo. And then there's converging lines. And so with converging lines, the goal is to really make the viewer want to follow the path. And so this was the other thing that I had mentioned, earlier about, if you don't have something at the end that's the award, then you need to make the path itself be very interesting. And so we have all of the fall colors here along both sides of this river, and you just kind of enjoy that as you work your way through. And then in this case, it's also important to have a foreground element there as well. And then there's the S-curve. So leading lines don't necessarily need to be straight. Use of curves, it almost gives kind of a relaxing feeling to a photo. And I've got no idea why that is, but it just seems to do that. In this case, I've got a really low angle. Notice that, the water takes up maybe the bottom 10% of this frame. I've got those trees looming up, really tall, behind it. This is a situation of using a longer focal length lens. This was probably 200 millimeters. I think I was shooting this with my 200 to 500 at the time. So this is probably a 200 millimeters, makes those trees look really nice and big, just kind of looming over the guys that are fishing there. And then there's repeating elements. Works very similar to converging lines, but uses a repeating element instead. Typically a wide angle to standard, so anything from like depending upon if your crop sensor or full frame crop sensor, like 10 millimeter on up to about maybe a 50 millimeter with full frame somewhere between 14 millimeter to 70 millimeter is going to give you this kind of perspective. As you start to get longer focal lengths than that, two things start to happen. Depth of field becomes an issue, as well as you don't get that diminishing view of the elements in the background, so they almost start to become too much of the same height. And then we can combine things. So having a foreground element and leading lines, in this case, there's also a secondary subject in the background. So, not only is there kind of an implied leading line going along the trees, bringing you back, but once you get back there, you also have some additional structures back there as well. And then, here's another example where we've got, nice foreground with the cacti. You've got a little bit of a leading line taking you in to the saguaro, along with another set of leading lines from the sunburst or the sun rays, bringing you back to the sunset in the background. So a lot of things just kind of driving you into the image, adding a lot of depth to it as we're going through. And in this case, I've got two sets of converging lines, but really the thing here is, we've got this stream, but really where I'm taking you back to is this just amazing sky we've got in the background. And so, that's kind of that, reward. You're kind of looking at the river, and all of a sudden you see these just fantastic clouds, sitting back there. So before we get into knowing where to, so I'll just take a quick pause here to see if we have any other questions.
If anybody does have a question, you can ask them yourself. One of the things that has struck me, Don, is how wide-angle lenses can cause some confusion.
Yes. And I know, I've got a friend who says, experience is what you get when you didn't get what you expected. And so I've gained a lot of experience with wide angle lenses, with, just some of the results that I've gotten that you think, oh, this is going to be perfect. Because, you get so much of the scene in, but it really does a lot of cases not do, what you want. Now here's a case here, with this particular spot where a wide angle lens is perfect, because again, the emphasis in this one was really that sky, and we were headed back. This was actually taken in Yellowstone in winter, and we're heading back to West Yellowstone at the end of the day, and just saw the sky and just had to stop and get this photo. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about knowing where to focus, and this is another thing I think, especially with people that are new to landscape photography, um, really struggle a little bit, and it's because you don't necessarily want to focus where your main subject is. And so it's something referred to as the hyperfocal distance. And with landscape photography, this is a really important concept. It used to be taught a lot back in the film days, especially with prime lenses. And then for some reason we got away from it. And I don't know why that is. But the idea is the hyperfocal point is that spot in the scene where if you focus on that spot, everything is going to be acceptably sharp all the way from front to back. Well, almost. It's actually everything halfway between you and that spot, all the way out to infinity, will be acceptably sharp. That last distance between you and that point, that first half distance, actually will be a little bit soft. And so just a warning, a little bit of math ahead just to kind of explain it. So there's a little formula I have you could just kind of do in your head just to kind of understand where the hyperfocal point is. And not really, but the whole point of having this formula here is to just show what are the things that affect where this point is. And it really comes down to two things that we have control over, the focal length of the lens and the aperture setting. There's something else that's referred to as the circle of confusion limit. That is actually a fixed value that's based on your sensor size. And so what that is it's defined as the largest blur spot that's going to be perceived by the human eye as a point. And so there's this little formula. It doesn't change it regardless of what lens you have, what the scene is, that number is always the same. So that doesn't affect your distance at all. So it's really understanding the importance of your aperture and the focal length of the lens to know where to find the spot. And so a couple of examples, just running through it. If we're shooting 16 millimeters and we're at f8, then we have 3.2 feet is where we want to focus, and that's from the sensor. So the nice thing about that is we can actually use our hand. If we have a remote cord, we can actually just reach out in front. In fact, it's kind of a fun thing to do if there's a lot of people around, because they won't know what you're doing. And if you listen, you'll hear all kinds of interesting comments about, what is that person doing? I remember one time I was out someplace and I actually heard this couple saying, what's that guy doing? And then the other person said, I think he's taking a picture of his hand. And then the first person said, we should probably get away from him. But if you go from 16 to 24 millimeters, which isn't that much of a change, you could see it more than doubles, where you need to focus. And then from 24 to 50, it goes all the way from 7 to 31 feet. So that point gets out there quite a bit. And you're probably thinking, there's no way I'm going to know all of this. I'm, where to do it. But there's apps for doing this. I use the first one up on the upper left, simple DOF calculator. Doesn't necessarily have the best reviews, but for me, it's the one that's the most intuitive. There's a lot of others out there. They're available on iPhone and Android. Also, if you've got tools like Photo Pills, Planet Pro, they have tables that you can look at. I like these apps better. I do use Photo Pills for a lot of my planning, but for when I'm trying to figure out where the hyperfocal point is, I'd much rather prefer using one of these apps. You'll notice that the screenshot I have of simple DOF calculator shows it in meters. You actually can switch it to feet, which I did. So you've got that option of either metric or imperial as well. So it does help quite a bit, and that's really where you should be focused. So even though a mountain or a waterfall or something else, maybe that's your main subject, but there's probably a rock or something else that's roughly where that hyperfocal point is, where you really want to be focused. So let's talk a little bit about showing scale, and then we'll take another break for questions. And so scale is another thing, and if you think back to the pitfalls, it's really kind of giving the viewer an appreciation for both the size of the scene as well as the size of the objects within the scene. And so it's really providing those visual clues to give that sort of sense. And when we look at this photo here, we've got this trail, but we've got the people out there. And when you see the people compared to the size of everything else, we know how big people are. So automatically we have a good sense of scale as to how big everything is in the scene. And so this particular shot, I thought this is kind of an interesting example. So here again, it's really hard to know how big everything is. This was taken in the Alabama hills, and you're going to think that the next shot was actually photoshopped, but the next shot was actually a test shot that I ended up actually liking better. And so there was this person that was in my shot. I'm not even sure what they were taking a picture of. There's absolutely nothing interesting over in that direction, but apparently to this person there was. And so I thought, okay, well, I'm waiting for them to move or do something. I'll just take a few shots, just make sure I've got my exposure right, make sure I've got my framing right, and then when they leave, I'll take my shot. And so I took a few shots like this, and then took this shot, which was the one that I thought I wanted. And then I got back and looking, it's like this doesn't really work, for all of those reasons, and ended up actually liking this shot much better with the person in it, even though it was a person that's that was in my shot, because now it tells me exactly how big. Just that one little addition makes a huge difference in understanding what the scale is of this environment. When we have unusually sized subjects too, then we definitely need to do it. So this was taken in redwoods, and this was actually a German couple. They were just very politely waiting behind me, and I was trying to figure out how am I going to get this shot and really give the sense of how big these trees really are. And I was really kind of struggling. And then I noticed them just standing back there, and they're being very quiet. I was like, oh no, please go ahead. And I figured I would get a shot of them right as the trail actually goes around behind that one tree there. I thought I'd get it just before they went around that, because that would really show the difference in size between two adults and these massive trees. And then just out of dumb luck, right as they got there, they decided to hold hands, and so it's just like everything just kind of came together, just really nice. But if I didn't have them in there, you would have no sense for how massive these trees, really are. And so, again, just having some people in makes a difference. But it doesn't have to be people. It can be, almost anything. In this case, bring your pet bighorn sheep with you. Just have it kind of wander out. And this is a spot that's called the Ancient Hunters Overlook out in the Badlands, and everybody had told me for years this is the spot you go for bighorn sheep, and I had never actually seen one at this location. Seen a lot of others in the park, but never here. And this one morning, lo and behold, there just happened to be one. But I really needed to also show the background too, and really kind of make those formations look a lot bigger than they really are. So in this case, 200 millimeter lens, not to get a nice close-up of the bighorn sheep, that's actually not what I wanted. I was really going for something more along the lines of what you see in a lot of Art Wolf's photos of, really having that animal being just more of a reference and just helping to show or give a sense of scale, even though I did exaggerate the scale quite a bit. If you went to the spot and you looked at it, you'd say, oh, that's really not what it looked like in the photo. Those formations in the background, seemed like they were a lot bigger in the picture that Don showed us.
Is
So,
is that your pet bighorn sheep that you had out there in that photo?
yeah, he goes with me everywhere, pretty much. It was just a wild bighorn sheep that just happened to walk into the scene. Really kind of unexpected. Like I said, I've been to the spot a number of times and I just never ever saw any, here in this one morning, he just happened to be there. Any other questions before we start talking about working with light? Okay, so let's talk about light a little bit, and just think back to the very first pitfall that I showed, very flat image, and one of the comments that I made about that was that there was no shadowing, and so time of day can really go a long way towards really getting a lot of depth into our photo. And so this is, there's just a lot more here because we've got this side lighting coming in. It's really showing off a lot more definition within the scene. And it can be a bright sunny day and we can still have no shadows, even if it's later in the day, because a lot of it has to do with sun placement. And the thing that we want to really avoid is having that sun coming directly over our shoulder. And now part of the reason for that is when we do that, we lose a lot of depth because we lose a lot of the shadow. Another problem with it coming right over your shoulder, especially if it's later or early in the day, is you also get yourself in the photo from your own shadows. So talk a little bit about different times of day. We hear about golden hour, which actually isn't an hour. It's roughly like 30 some odd minutes, but it's basically considered to be the best time to shoot. The light is nice and warm. It's going through a lot more of the atmosphere, actually picking up pollutants and that. So that's why we have those fires out west. We have that really nice warm sun late in the day. A lot of it's being caused by that, but really, really makes for a much more pleasing photo. But middle of the day can work too. So this was actually taken around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, middle of summer. And the thing that's important is we need to make sure that we have a really, really strong subject. And there needs to be some color, but not an enormous amount of color. And so in this case, because we've got a lot of, just really dark rock, but then we've got the water with the tannins and everything else in it, it really does kind of work. And there's some other things that we can do. Some people will do things like, work with HDR, which is taking multiple photos at different exposures and then using software to combine them. That can be another technique that works. But a lot of times you can find scenes where you don't have to do that, such as this one. And in fact, in that case, an HDR wouldn't work because of the moving water. Sunset, so kind of right at the end of that golden hour, creates great opportunities for silhouettes. Your silhouette does need to be sharp. That is kind of an important aspect of it, and backlighting. And so, it works out really well. The one caution when doing a shot like this is you don't want to do it with too long of a telephoto lens because that could actually damage your camera. So just be a little careful of that. So try to stay, really below, I would say 120 millimeters, for a focal length if you're taking, this type of shot pointing directly into the sun. And then after the sun sets or before the sun rises, is another great time, referred to as the blue hour. And this is just before sunrise, just after sunset. It gives you this cool, even lighting. It kind of gives almost like an otherworldly type of an effect. Also, you get some kind of interesting colors in the skies too during the blue hour. So really kind of an interesting time to shoot. I really like shooting at that time of day. I've gotten some fantastic images over the years doing that. And then moonlight. So the moon can actually act as a terrific light source. And in fact, most of the light that you see here in this photo is actually from the moon. It gives kind of that nice glow. It's got a little bit of a color cast to it, so you do need to, maybe deal with that a little bit. But in general, a nice long exposure, which you can kind of tell from looking at the water. It's got a little bit of that misty look to it. That moon is a lot brighter than you would think. And in fact, I remember back when my kids were young, and they were in scouts. I remember we would do these full moon hikes where nobody would take a flashlight. There'd be plenty of light to actually see the trail and everything else. So, so take advantage of that as well. So let's talk a little bit about context and adding context to the photo. So we've talked about the basics up to this point, and now we really want to get those images that are the ones that really put us in that place and really kind of make us really feel what's going on. And this is when we talk about the emotion and all of those sorts of things that go along with a truly successful landscape image. This is one of the things that really kind of comes into play. And so with context, what we're really looking for is giving that sense of place and introducing familiar items. And I think early on, one of the things that I struggled with was I always wanted my landscape images to be pristine, just nature, nothing man-made, nothing artificial, just whatever nature had. And there are some great images you can make that way that can still have context and still tell a story. But if you start always trying to eliminate those, you're going to miss out on some really good opportunities for some really nice photos. In this case, and this is a photo I've sold, many copies of over the years. The reason it all comes together is I've got that fishing pier in the background. I've got the fog coming up off the water. I've got the island there. I've got the sun coming through it. All of this, is just contributing to this great sense of place. In this case, it's up in the Boundary Waters area. You've got all of this great stuff just kind of coming together, and people look at that and they're instantly transported, back to the spot. It just gives that really nice, comfortable feeling, just by looking at it. The interesting thing about this shot is that shortly before this shot was taken, it was actually snowing. And shortly after this shot was taken, it was actually snowing. The sun just peeked out for a minute, debated whether or not to even go out that morning, but figured, up, so might as well do the drive and go get the shot, and was definitely, rewarded for it. And it can be rather simple. Don't try to overcomplicate. So in this case, essentially two elements in this photo. Have the polar bear, and we've got I don't know what the story is behind that old boat or barge or whatever it is. It's just kind of abandoned there, just on the shore. But if I just had one versus the other, there just wouldn't be as much interest in this photo. Now you could come up with all kinds of just different stories in your head about what's going on here. So you do get this again. It's all about having this sense of place. And then we can also use the background to really kind of add context. So another thing I like to photograph: old cars, old trucks. Came across this one in this ghost town, and having what's in the background, really kind of add context to the truck. It gives the truck actually a sense of place. And if you notice, the background elements are arranged very carefully to provide negative space. And what I mean by that is there's no overlap. And so that adds that depth aspect to the photo itself. And so I've got this truck in the foreground. It's clearly the main subject. It's what I want you looking at. But then I've got the ghost town in the background. So that's giving all of that additional context to it. But it could also be a sense of time. So not just a sense of place, but a sense of time. This was actually just taken over in Lakeville, Minnesota, just a few years ago. Actually, about 5 years ago now, I think of it. So more than a few years ago, but time flies a little bit. This was full moon, harvest time. The plowed up pumpkins in the foreground. I had to make a choice here, actually. I couldn't really get everything that I wanted in focus, so I opted for having the storage bin, the trees, and the moon, and opted to let the foreground go a little soft. This photo was actually picked up. This was one of the quote unquote super moons. Still not quite sure why they call them that, since it seems like we have them all the time. But this was actually picked up by a newspaper in Virginia. They were clouded over. They wanted a photo of it. I was kind of curious how honest they were going to be with where the photo was taken, but they did actually say that it was taken actually in Minnesota and not out in Virginia. There's actually a paper in the Norfolk area that ran the photo. But it's all about, you see the pumpkins, you see the moon, you see the grain, you just think fall. It just kind of all comes together. And then we could also appeal to the other senses. So in this case, all of the steam coming up, you just look at this between the steam and the snow. You've got the bison kind of clumped together. You just know that this is a very cold scene. And it's kind of interesting. I was reading something recently. I forget who it was. One famous landscape photographer. I don't remember who exactly it was. Might have been Mark Munch. Was saying that really successful landscape images fall into one of two categories. They show a place that is just really beautiful and you just want to be there, or they show a place that's just really miserable, but you're happy because you're viewing it from a place that's nice and comfortable and warm. And this probably falls into that second category. But just a lot of atmospheric stuff going on here, just really kind of appealing to the senses, giving that just feeling of cold. And so we have context, but now we can actually take that a step further and actually get into storytelling. And here's a photo of a photographer. I get a lot of photos of photographers in my photos. They seem to just magically like to do that. In fact, there was a kite festival a couple of weekends ago out on Lake Harriet here in the Twin Cities, and this one guy literally walked right in front of me and just like squatted down to start taking photos. And I guess those of you that have met me in person, I'm not exactly tiny, but I guess it's easy to miss somebody that's 6'5" and has a camera and a tripod out and realize, oh, they're probably taking a picture. But yeah, so I managed to get quite a few. But familiar activities are something that's really really good for telling stories. And so this would actually be probably an okay photo, but maybe a little bit on the boring side if I didn't have the fly fisherman. And so now with the fly fisherman, we've got the story going on of someone being out in Montana, out on this pristine stream. You've got some interesting scenery in the background, everything kind of working together. You can come up with all kinds of stories around this. Another example, Nordic skier, just some other just very basic elements. And in fact, this photo probably wouldn't work at all if she hadn't skied into the scene. But it doesn't necessarily have to be people. So here we've got this shack. It's out in the desert in the Bullfrog Hills area. gives that story of isolation, loneliness. If you actually look inside there, somebody did actually live there at one point. There was the remnants of a bed and a table and a few other things, going back to I forget what they mined in this area, but you know, but just kind of completes that. In fact, if that building wasn't there, this image wouldn't work at all. So just to kind of summarize, the biggest thing to remember is that we see things in 3 dimensions, but our cameras really only see in 2. And just by the proper placement of elements within a photo, we can add a lot of depth. And then using familiar objects, we can start to get that sense of scale, and then we can build on that to add context. And then finally, the strongest images out there also will tell a story. So with that, I'll open it up for questions.
If you have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself. Well, Don,
on that river scene, where you had dark rock and pretty bright water,
Yep.
Did you compensate your exposure?
Yeah, so the approach that I use actually for all of my landscape photos is I'll actually take spot meter readings. So I put my camera in spot meter mode. And so I'll meter off of first whatever I think is the brightest spot in the scene. And then I will have my exposure set. So looking at the meter, that I'm as close to being overexposed as possible without quite being there. And then I'll go take a reading off of the darkest spot, and I'll see if I've got some room there or not. Hopefully nothing is completely blocked out. If I've got a little bit, I actually do like in my landscape images to have a little bit of pure black. I think it does add just a little bit of richness to the photo, but I don't want a lot. I just want, just a little bit. And so then I'll kind of adjust. And so if I see that I've got a lot of room on the dark end, then what I might do is I might bring my exposure down a little bit so that I'm not quite all the way up against the edge, although I do like to do what they refer to as shoot to the right, of capturing basically the brightest image that I can. But I will try to temper that a little bit if I do have a lot of room on the dark side. And then I'll just do a couple of mid-tone readings too, just to, doesn't really do anything, but just makes me feel better. So after I do that, then I'm confident in my camera settings that then I take the shot. And what I found by doing that is that, I don't have to rely as much on using things like, graduated neutral density filters and things like that. I tend to not like to use filters, although in that particular shot, I did use a 6-stop neutral density, mainly because I wanted that silky water look. In the middle of the day, you're just not going to get that without the use of filters. Other questions?
I think you covered things so well, Don, that you answered a lot of questions during your program.
Well, thanks. Yeah, so I hope you enjoyed the program. Like I said, landscape photography is something that I really enjoy. I do a lot of it. Over the course of a year, I've been fortunate to get to a lot of pretty amazing places to be able to do that too. So that helps. Scott Kelby, kind of paraphrasing, says, if you want beautiful landscape photos, put yourself in beautiful places. Sounds like kind of a flippant remark by Scott, but there is some truth to that too. That when you can get to some of these places, and in the U.S., we've got our national park system, which is just absolutely amazing. I've yet to go to a national park, and I've probably been to over half of them. And be disappointed with what's there. There's always something, amazing to see and capture.
Well, I'm getting some comments in the chat. Seems like people here are very appreciative of your program. Excellent presentation, really interesting. Thank you. Thank you for a very interesting and informative session. Thanks so much, Don. It was very interesting and educational.
Well, thanks. I appreciate the comments, and as others in the club, I know there were some people that couldn't make it, but I know you do have it recorded. So if you do have questions, come up later thinking about something, feel free to email me, don@frozenhiker.com. So pretty easy to kind of remember. Be more than happy to answer questions, down the line.
Well, thanks so much, Don.
You're
Really
welcome.
appreciate it.